the next plague that we have, the ninth plague, is the plague of darkness. Now, what do you guys think about this plague? Because I find it kind of interesting. It seems different than the others. And
I find the interesting the contrast that it's Egypt that's enshrouded in darkness, but the Israelites still have light, and obviously it seems to be an indication of some sort of spiritual condition as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lack of light is pretty disturbing. I mean, kids, I'm afraid of the dark, whatever,
Right.
go to sleep. There's a psychological component to it. I can only imagine what an entire society, how that would feel.
Right.
I imagine there would have been a lot of screaming and yelling and crying and I mean, we know the sun's coming up tomorrow.
Right.
That would be pretty oppressive. And so...
Yeah, I can imagine that this would be, obviously, to this point, the most disconcerting plague that they've experienced.
Yeah.
And this darkness is described as something that's kind of not like a natural darkness.
Yeah.
It's kind of thick. And imagine everywhere you go,
Oppressive.
just not being able to see anything. And not even like, at night. At night you can see
Like
stuff.
go in the middle of a cave and turn the lights out.
Right.
Yeah.
And just that's everything that you're experiencing for as long as the plague lasts. Like you're not seeing any hint of light at all. And apparently it doesn't matter whether you light a lamp or a candle or anything like that. Like
Yeah,
this is
right.
just, it's like you've gone blind, basically.
Yeah.
I can imagine that this would be completely terrifying. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is that light has this image in the Bible of there's a spiritual aspect to it. It's the ability to see and perceive. It's the ability to understand. And understanding and consciousness is something that we really, even in our modern world, with all the science is discovered, we don't really have an explanation for how consciousness works and how people come to really understand things and what understanding is. But the idea that in the Bible is that it's actually a spiritual thing. It's not a physical thing, and that it can be gained or lost spiritually. What do you make of that idea that really understanding is primarily a spiritual and not a physical thing? Because we would have a lot of people in our culture today that would say, oh, it's just natural, it's rationality, it's completely natural, it's scientific, it's it's empirical.
I think it's interesting that understanding often has like a moral quality to it, and that somebody who is living a moral life often has a certain level of understanding of the world that somebody who is not living a moral life doesn't have.
Yeah. Without God to show you what everything around you means, there's kind of an element here where the Egyptians, because of their distance from God is now kind of turning off the lights, right?
Literally.
But yeah, and like everything that you see, everything that you interact with, everything that you ever encounter, you put in a value hierarchy, and you have an understanding of its meaning and purpose, and that the only place that can possibly come from is God. And if he were to suddenly turn that off on you, like you can't see the things around you because you don't understand what they are and what they're for, what their value is, what their place in the hierarchy is. That there's a terror there that is pretty awful to contemplate. And I think the most any of us ever get of that is just a small glimpse, and praise God for that, because I don't know how you get through that. But I think what you see here is people getting much more than a small glimpse of it. And without God, what do you do? Now, the gods that I think that are being addressed here are Ra and the sun god, and Pharaoh was supposed to be his son. So the sun sheds light on everything, and so that's what Pharaoh is supposed to do, with his edicts. And Pharaoh himself, as a king, is supposed to put in a hierarchy that matches the hierarchy of God. And what God is exposing here is that they are, this God and his son are have no knowledge of the truth. They have no light to give. And really, what's interesting is I think that it's incredibly, it's possible for us to find ourselves in this place. Now, obviously, I don't think it's going to have this physical manifestation and stuff like that, but I think that you can get to a point where you say, I don't believe in God anymore. Okay, well, now what? What are you going to replace all this with?
Lots of therapy.
Yeah.
Hopelessness.
Unfortunately, I'm not joking, and I know
Yeah.
people who are exactly in that place.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't understand how you do it. I don't understand how you. I don't see how you can just go on. There's a thought that you can just go on without him, and I just don't see how that's true.
I think you can for a season,
Yeah.
and
Kind of
but
living
as you
off the
said,
seed
things
corn.
are cyclical, and you
Yeah.
live off that seed corn, but eventually, there's a reckoning, and it's not pleasant, and it's
Yeah.
but we talked earlier about atheism and the nihilism that it kind of leads to and stuff like that, and initially there's a freedom, right? Because there's no such thing as sin, and nothing's immoral or moral or anything. There's no
Yeah.
good, there's no bad, and it's freeing, but eventually it's also just absent of all meaning, and that's far worse than having a God who has morality that's for your good.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's kind of frightening to me is that you look at all these gods that God is attacking, all the Egyptian gods that God is attacking. They are values that have some value but don't belong at the top of the hierarchy. And but the thing is that in your life you can put anything at the top of that hierarchy and do that long enough and completely enough, and it can destroy the entire hierarchy, and you can find yourself in this place. Whether it's romantic relationships, whether it's money, whether it's prestige, fame, whatever. You can. I've seen recently a number of religious leaders that have put something other than God at the top of the hierarchy, and they did that for long enough where they could no longer reconcile the contradiction, and so they eventually dropped God. And so you can get here. You don't have to engage in every sin. You don't have to engage in you don't have to put everything out of order to get into this darkness. You can put one thing out of order for long enough and completely enough to get there, which to me is a very frightening thing.
It's funny because one of the early things of some of the Bible studies we had on Thursday nights back in the day, one of the real kind of central things that I'd never really thought about was, you talked about having to order your loves. And I just never heard that phrase. And it's not that we often love the wrong things. They're just out of order and often in significant ways that's disastrous.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine loving something that has zero value, because there just aren't very many things that have zero value. And so almost everything is something that has some kind of value, that deserves some amount of love, but almost inevitably it's given the wrong amount, and that's enough to create utter chaos given enough time. You have this moment of freedom, and that moment of freedom is, I can now put this thing at the top of my hierarchy without any kind of feelings of guilt, right? And so let's say that you have somebody that's a womanizer. And so I'm aware of a guy, I don't know him personally, but just through his writings, I'm aware of a guy that came from a Christian family and decided to throw that Christianity off and just pursue women. And he became famous, internationally known for bedding women, and wrote books about it and
Right.
taught guys how to engage in it. And he's free to put this now at the top of his hierarchy, but to put it at the top of the hierarchy means you have to value it. And the problem is that where does its value come from if not from God? Eventually, this is what I mean by eating the seed corn, is that he's giving this a value, that only actually comes from God having a place for it within the hierarchy. Once you get rid of God, you've gotten rid of his hierarchy. You actually get rid of the value of all things. And so eventually that thing becomes valueless. And so now the problem is that you're trying to live your life pursuing things that ultimately have no value, and they lose their value. You start pursuing these things, and it's so great because you're so free to do it. But then what happens when that thing loses its value completely? The thing that you built your life around, you get no satisfaction out of. And so maybe you find something else for a short time, but it's not long before that thing loses its value, and then pretty soon you're in the darkness where everything around you is dark. And I know people who live in that place, and it's a pretty sad thing. It's a terrible existence.
I'm reminded of Ken's comment from, I don't know, last week or the week before about Abraham sacrificing his son, and if he'd not chosen God over his son, in the end he wouldn't have been able to keep his son either. But like you said, put your son up at the top of that hierarchy, and it's going to lose its value too.
Yeah.
It sounded like you were describing Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes,
Yeah.
who spared nothing from himself.
Right.
I don't know how. It's an interesting thought to think what was the extent of, because it doesn't sound like he lost his faith in God, at least at the writing of the book.
Right.
But certainly the rest of his life is.
Yeah, it wasn't on an upward trajectory.
Right,
trajectory.
right,
Yeah.
and he did lots of things.